Good morning, everybody. I hope by now everybody's over their jet lag, but in a day or two you'll be back in it. So, I'd like to thank Father Gruner for asking me to speak today on a topic I have researched for 25 years, because it's a fundamental attack on the integrity of our Holy Mother, the Church. And it is an attack that can only be understood and resolved with the help of Our Lady of Fatima. I've only scratched the surface of this topic and the significance of this problem, but I hope to share today something of what I've discovered with you. And the full title of my talk is Feminism, Russia's Deadly Weapon Against the Family. As we know, Our Lady of Fatima warned that as long as the collegial consecration of Russia is not done, Russia would spread its errors around the world, causing persecution of the Church. And when one thinks about persecution, one normally considers it to be a bloody persecution, and that's true of Russia. However, persecution can also kill the soul. It can be spiritual. And my talk is about a spiritual persecution carried out by Russia with the weapon that is known as feminism. It is a deadly error that has not been fought by the Church after the reign of Pius XII, who spent much of his pontificate battling against it. Ultimately, the attack is by Satan. With the help of communism, whose headquarters is Russia, he is using woman against the family. But why the family? Well, let's consider something that Pope John Paul II said. Quote, "The Christian family is the first community called to announce the gospel to the human person." Now, the Catholic Church is an army, the Church militant, and her duty is to fight the enemy of man's soul, which is Satan, and to fight this by evangelizing the world, converting people from the kingdom of Satan to the kingdom of Christ. Since the Christian family is the first instrument of evangelization, that means it is at the front of the Church's army. The Pope also said, Christian marriage and the Christian family build up the Church. That is, the family continually adds fresh troops to the Church militant. And this is especially important in providing priestly and religious workers for Christ's vineyard. As Pope Pius XII taught, quote, "From the family, founded according to the divine will on the legitimate union of man and woman, Christ and the universal Church draw the ministers and apostles of the gospel, the priests and heralds who nourish the faithful and cross the seas to enlighten and save souls." And in his encyclical on Christian marriage Arcanum, Pope Leo XIII noted Christ's command that marriage is meant to increase not just the human race, but also the Church, so that, he said, a people might be born and brought up for the worship and religion of the true God and our Savior, Jesus Christ. Obviously then, the success of the family is crucial to the success of the Church's mission. So if you want to kill true family life, in which children are raised to fear and serve God, then the Church is finished. And as the Catholic Church and the Catholic family go, so does society, enabling Satan to finally rule the world. Pope Pius XII observed, quote, "The nation has always drawn its strength, its increase, its honor from the healthy and virtuous family. If this is attacked in its religious and moral foundation, the way is open to the worst possible harm to social institutions and to the nation itself." Lenin knew this, and he declared, "Destroy the family, you destroy the country. By extension, destroy families around the world, and you abolish the existing social order." In 1880, Pope Leo had stated that the communists aimed to destroy Christian marriage, and if they succeeded, families and societies would be driven into the overthrow of order, which is the wicked aim of socialists and communists. That's what we're in the midst of today. The transformation of the old Christian order into the anti-Christian New World Order. The Communist Manifesto, published on February the 21st, 1948, declared war in the following terms, and I quote from it. The communist revolution involves the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality. Communists support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order. Their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. So in 1937, Pius XI, in his encyclical on atheistic communism, Divini Redemptoris, reported that communist leaders openly boasted that their goal is to destroy Christian civilization and the Christian religion by banishing every remembrance of them from the hearts of men, especially of the young. This struggle against Christian civilization, he said, is directed from Moscow. Now, for this struggle, the major weapon that Satan has put into the hands of Russian communism is the one he first used successfully in the Garden of Eden. A modern-day Marxist notes, quote, "It is no accident that women began the Russian Revolution of 1917 on International Women's Day. This is a reference to the demonstration and strikes by thousands of women on March the 8th in Russia that was the first step in the Bolshevik Revolution." Pope Pius XI warned us of what to expect if Russian communism were allowed to flourish. He called Bolshevistic communism the new gospel offered to the world as the glad tidings of deliverance and salvation. It is a system full of errors and sophisms. It is in opposition both to reason and to divine revelation. It subverts the social order because it means the destruction of its foundations. End of quote. Well, the foundation of society is the family. And communism's effects on womanhood and the family can be seen in the characteristics of communism that were exposed by Pope Pius XI. And only by understanding these characteristics can you see how the crisis of faith and the crisis of marriage stem from Russia's errors. These characteristics are as follows, and I quote from his encyclical. First, communism removes all the moral restraints that check the eruptions of blind impulse. Second, communists hold the principle of absolute equality, rejecting all hierarchy and divinely constituted authority, including the authority of parents. Third, refusing to human life any sacred or spiritual character, communism makes of marriage and the family a purely artificial and civil institution, the outcome of a specific economic system. There exists no matrimonial bond of a juridico-moral nature that is not subject to the whim of the individual or of the collectivity. Naturally, therefore, the notion of an indissoluble marriage tie is scouted, that is disdained. Fourth, communism is particularly characterized by the rejection of any link that binds woman to the family and the home, and her emancipation is proclaimed as a basic principle. Let me repeat that. Communism is particularly characterized by the rejection of any link that binds woman to the family and the home, and her emancipation is proclaimed as a basic principle. She is withdrawn from the family and the care of her children to be thrust instead into public life and collective production under the same conditions as man. The care of home and children then devolves upon the collectivity, that is, upon the organs of the state such as public schools and daycare, all of which work against the authority of parents, furthering the communist goal of absolute equality through class warfare. Fifth point, the right of education is denied to parents, for it is conceived as the exclusive prerogative of the community, that is the state, in whose name and by whose mandate alone parents may exercise this right. Based on these characteristics, clearly the West today is thoroughly communist, because the foundation of society, the family, has been communized through the corruption of women. These communist characteristics are also characteristic of the women's movement. Women have been emancipated from the home and family in pursuance of self-fulfillment and a career. Increasingly, women are working under the same conditions as men. There are almost no more exclusively male occupations, and women's inclusion in them has led to their masculinization and a loss of the maternal instinct. At the same time, men are being feminized by role reversal and political correctness. The principles of absolute equality and the rejection of divinely appointed hierarchy are harming marriage and also the church, as women demand ordination, seeing the priesthood as just a job that should be open to women. The collectivity is raising younger and younger children as their masculinized mothers are thrust into increasing the productivity of the state. State-operated schools are now the norm in most areas of the world. Further, all moral restraint has been removed as Satan targets the family in its most vulnerable spot, the church's moral code, particularly the 6th and 9th commandments. This is where the front line of the church militant is being breached, because if you weaken morals, you weaken faith. Indeed, all the assaults on marriage and the family, such as divorce and remarriage, cohabitation, perverse sexuality, sex education, artificial procreation, pornography, prostitution, family planning, abortion, unmarried motherhood, all these are assaults on the moral teachings of the church. But they also constitute a spiritual persecution because they weaken the faith. Faith and morals are two sides of the coin of Christian religion, and they cannot be separated. Immorality involves breaking the commandments, and the commandments underpin the faith. In an approved apparition in Quito, Ecuador in 1634, you heard about this the other day, Our Lady prophesied this about the 19th and 20th centuries, which she named by name. She said, "The precious light of the faith will go out in souls because of the almost total moral corruption." Pope Leo XIII blamed the anathemized, baneful heresy of divorce for the destruction of marriage, morality, and society. This had happened in ancient Rome, and in more modern times began, he said, with the Protestant Revolt and the French Revolution. Divorce, he showed in his encyclical, is the root of moral corruption. Pope Pius XII saw a connection between the crisis of marriage and women's loss of faith, morality, and obedience to the teachings of the Church, whilst Pope Benedict, as Cardinal Ratzinger, asserted that the crisis of morality is closely tied to that of woman and her role. Since it is particularly feminists, not all women, who lack faith, obedience, and morality, and who have been redefining women's role, it would seem that the two popes have laid the blame for today's moral crisis on the feminist movement. So let us briefly look at the history of feminism, and that will bear them out. This history that I'm going to give you is taken from the writings of leading feminists, most of whom are professedly Catholic. Feminism's beginnings lie in the political suffragette movement of the 19th century. By the turn of that century, two branches of the feminist tree were developing. The first was secular, and the second called religious, spiritual, or Christian feminism. Both branches were socialist and part of the revolution from the beginning. And that is why we cannot divide feminism into a benign versus a radical form. Religious feminism, which spread from Protestantism into Catholicism in the 20th century, adopted paganism for its spirituality. Feminists searched for historical precedents for women's equality and appropriated what they themselves admit were Germanic myths of a primitive universal matriarchal society. They imagined matriarchal society to be a communal egalitarian society where woman existed as a free person whose labor and sexuality was at her own disposal. So-called patriarchy with sexual restrictions then arose, which ended matriarchal communism and subjugated women. The leading American Catholic feminist, Rosemary Ruther, admitted that feminists actually lifted this matriarchal myth from communism. Communism co-founder Friedrich Engels had absorbed these romantic anthropological theories into socialism. This seduced women into the revolution against the Christian order. Indeed, if you read the writings of Marx, Engels, and the anthropological works on which they drew, you see there the feminist ideology almost word for word. The two carrots dangled in front of women were equality of the sexes and economic independence, both promoted as social progress. Ruther said feminists had to join the socialist revolution to escape from patriarchal subjugation. Besides ideological support, the communist state provided them with a working example of a society in which women had full and equal employment with men, that is, economic independence, which was seen as the key to women's liberation. Pope Pius XI said communism's goal was to break women's ties to her family. And Ruther said communism's main agenda was to integrate women into the workforce, making them independent wage earners and equal partners with men on the job and within marriage. But what she doesn't mention is that this was because Marx wanted to abolish the family and make woman the slave of the state to boost productivity whilst destroying the church at the same time. The Communist Manifesto openly calls for the family to be abolished. For its rationale, it applies both its class theories and its materialistic economic theories to the family. Communism sees the traditional family as embodying class distinctions and as a foundation of a society based on class divisions. For a worldwide egalitarian collective, all unjust power structures have to be overthrown, and the family, which arose with private property and patriarchy, is considered one of those power structures. Capitalism, characterized by private property and individual households, is the root, they say, of the oppression of women. Basing himself on ancient Greek civilization and mythology, Engels declared in his 1884 work titled The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, that the first form of class opposition was the development of monogamous marriage, by which he meant a marriage of unequals. And the first class oppression was that of the female sex by the male. The family, with its role structures, parallels and feeds the subjugation of the proletariat, which is the oppressed or working class, by the ruling capitalist or bourgeois class. This is how Engels put it. Quote, "The modern individual family is founded on the open or concealed domestic slavery of the wife, and modern society is a mass composed of those individual families as its molecules. Within the family, the husband is the bourgeois, and the wife represents the proletariat." The Communist Manifesto declares, "The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy, which is equality." Further, the manifesto accuses the capitalist bourgeois husband of seeing his wife as a mere instrument of production. Now, communism doesn't have a problem with women as instruments of production, but it does have a problem with that instrument being in an individual family. The proletariat, says the manifesto, is to wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie and to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, which the manifesto defines as the proletariat organized as the ruling class. All this, says the manifesto, is to increase productive forces as rapidly as possible. So we see that the emancipation of women is necessary to overthrow capitalism, and overthrowing capitalism is necessary for their emancipation. Applying class and economic theories to the family, Engels says that in order to create equality between husband and wife, the first condition for the liberation of the wife is to bring the whole female sex back into public industry, and this in turn demands the abolition of the monogamous family as the economic unit of society. This new setup is what he calls the proletarian family, or the proletarian marriage, meaning a marriage of equals, as opposed to the monogamous family of class divisions. This Marxist idea became the foundation of the feminist movement. As expressed by French feminist Simone de Beauvoir, whose 1949 book, The Second Sex, became the feminist Bible, she said, "Only socially productive labor makes a man truly human, and so to be equal to man, the woman must not only join the workforce, but even give up her femininity." The Communist Manifesto also accuses the bourgeois family of exploiting its other private property, children. And it calls for replacing home education by social, that is, state education, in order to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. Into this ruling class, we can place the Catholic Church as well. In 1889, Freemasonry, the parent of communism, deemed that in order to advance its universal socialist republic, quote, "freedom of thought and conscience of the children has to be developed systematically in the child at school and protected as far as possible against all disturbing influences, not only of the church, but also of the children's own parents." Ruther proudly notes that the communists set up state daycare, maternity leave, contraception and abortion, and they got rid of patriarchal laws that discriminated against women in marriage and divorce. Engels explained that in the proletarian family with the working wife, male supremacy disappears and the wife has regained her ancient right to institute divorce. The wife can institute divorce. These provisions of the Marxist state are precisely the rights that feminists have been fighting for, and they have largely got them around the world. Now, this principle of absolute equality stems from the Masonic Illuminati, who commissioned Marx and Engels to write the Communist Manifesto, which reflects Illuminati principles. The Illuminati professed that the corruption of women was essential to destroy Catholicism. Even the wars and revolutions that Masonry has fomented to engender its socialist New World Order have been used to corrupt women. In December 1917, Pope Benedict XV exposed this connection. Quote, "Since the French Revolution, men have worked hard to confine within ever narrower limits the Church's influence for good, in the hope that finally this influence would no longer make itself felt in society. Everything possible was done to snatch the woman from the maternal solicitude and the vigilance of the Church. It is in fact amazing what the woman can do for the good of the human race or for its ruin. If she should leave the common, that is traditional, road, both the civil and domestic orders are easily upset. With the decline in religion, cultured women have lost their piety, also their sense of shame. Many, in order to take up occupations ill-befitting their sex, took to imitating men. Others abandoned the duties of the housewife, for which they were fashioned, to cast themselves recklessly into the current of life. And this is the source of that deplorable perversion of morals which the disorder bred of the war," he's talking about World War I, "this is the source of that deplorable perversion of morals which the disorder bred of war has multiplied and propagated beyond all belief." So he said World War I, starting from the Masonic French Revolution, now he's talking about World War I, has helped to bring about the corruption of women and morals and society. Pope Pius XII similarly indicted the Second World War. In 1947, he referred to the devastating work done during the war and after the war towards the ruin of woman and the family. Now for feminists, the bottom line is power. Jobs, careers, or even ordination are not satisfactory enough. They want to control the world, making it the sinful matriarchal utopia that allegedly once existed. Recall that the Communist Manifesto called for the proletariat to become the ruling class. Ironically, seeking power has made feminists the useful idiots of communist men. It was from communist theories that feminist socialism emerged, says Ruther, as part of a comprehensive view of social progress that desired to better society and religion by supplanting Christian civilization with superior primitive values. Based on these values, she says, feminists sought to render Western biblical and social history non-normative, a passing phase of a larger scheme of social development that looked back to earlier origins. What spiritual feminists admired about matriarchal society was its belief in female divinity and the power associated with that divinity. Worship of the mother goddess was touted as the golden age of human society that was overthrown by the regressive influence of patriarchal religion, which displaced an earlier era of women's power. Spiritual feminists thus sought to revive the ancient matriarchal culture and religion as the more appropriate vehicle for female empowerment. 19th century Protestant feminists taught that Christianity is the prime source of the oppression of women. They declared emancipation is impossible unless the Bible is understood from a feminist perspective and repudiated as revelation. These are all their own words. Socialism became entwined with religious feminism through the Christian suffragettes. Christian socialists consider the all-male priesthood an affront to the notion of equality that they claimed had scriptural justification. They interpreted Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, "There does not exist among you male or female, all of you are one in Christ Jesus." They interpreted this as preaching human equality rather than the spiritual equality of those who live in faith. This was their ammunition for demanding institutional reform to include women in the priesthood. And women's ordination became a justice and human rights issue. Religious feminism didn't garner much support until after Vatican II, which opened the window to renewal, self-discovery, and détente with communism. In 1979, spiritual feminism became the self-proclaimed enemy of the Catholic Church by declaring that patriarchy must be attacked with all the strategies at our command. The first line of attack was to declare that women were oppressed by the church and needed liberation from its patriarchy. Now, patriarchy is just the feminist term for the authority of the church, and another word for it is hierarchalism. Their spirituality of liberation, feminists say, must replace the spirituality of domination grounded in patriarchy and hierarchy. So a feminist theology, I put that in quotes, was developed as a branch of liberation theology, espousing revolution to achieve social reform in the church. Equality for Christian feminists means the attainment of powerful positions in the church, total freedom in faith and morals, and autonomous control over their bodies. That is, freedom to practice contraception, abortion, and perverse sexuality. Class differences and heterosexism are considered expressions of the sin of patriarchal sexism. And sexism is their word for the unequal treatment of women. It is the only sin and the original sin, says Ruther. Christian feminists taught that the Bible was not inspired by God, but was a collection of interpretations of inexpressible truths written to justify patriarchal oppression. Tradition was seen as just a series of human choices which may be imaginatively revoked. Thus, the very foundations of the faith were attacked, namely, the revealed truth of Scripture and tradition. So they set about rewriting Scripture from their point of view, obtained from dreams and fantasies generated by Jungian psychology. This became their revelation, their word, and highlighted their divinity. They also drew on heretical Gnostic writings and community life, occult witchcraft and paganism to develop a feminist theology and spirituality, liturgies, and anti-sacraments. Religious feminism is clearly an heretical, syncretic, and occult religion. It even has a name, Woman Church or Women Church, with priestesses ordained by the feminists. While attending Women Church, many feminists also stay in the Catholic Church as the leaven of corruption in what they call a missionary field. Now, European Catholic women had been demanding ordination since the 1930s, and these demands increased with the ordination of Protestant women. Large numbers of Catholic women who studied in non-Catholic theological colleges and seminaries after the Council would have encountered these influences, as well as encountering the Marxist World Council of Churches propaganda that the struggle against sexism is an integral part of liberation theology, and the Christian goal should be an alliance with a socialist cause so that a world will be created from which, in accordance with Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, all discrimination will be banished. In the face of the Church's refusal to ordain women, the strategy became to place women in other liturgical roles, such as altar girls, readers, and so-called Eucharistic ministers. And it is hoped that this will gradually engender a climate of acceptance for priestesses, especially when accompanied by consciousness raising. Involvement in all these ministries is promoted as improving the practice of one's religion by sharing the responsibilities of worship equally with men. Rewriting the Bible, using inclusive language, rewriting liturgies to refer to sisters as well as brothers, all these are painted as improvements. But a Jewish feminist, Naomi Goldenberg, says that those unaware of the feminist agenda do not see such reforms as challenging the basic nature of Christianity, and what they are requesting are not minor alterations, but major departures from tradition that will shake Christianity at its roots. She calls sexual equality a heresy and subtitles her book, Feminism and the End of Traditional Religions. Indeed, feminists say ordination is only the tip of the iceberg. Once ordained, they intend to subvert patriarchal styles and structures. Well, given the damage they've done so far, just imagine what they could do once they ordained and promoted higher. The post-Vatican II experimentation in women's religious orders provided the right soil for Christian feminism to spread into Catholicism through nuns, who were turned into feminist nuns or ex-nuns, feminist ex-nuns. Why target nuns? Probably because of their widespread influence in many areas of Catholicism, in spite of patriarchy. Both mothers and nuns exercise great power in their spheres of influence through their maternity, the one being physical and the other spiritual. Regarding mothers, Pope Benedict XV said, quote, "In her home, the mother is queen, and even when away from the home, like a king away from his realm, she has her thoughts centered on its well-being." In his encyclical on Christian marriage, Casti Connubii, Pius XI described the family as a body, of which the husband is the head and the wife the heart. As he occupies the chief place in ruling, so she ought to claim for herself the chief place in love. Completely refuting feminist claims that the Church promotes the subjugation of wives, Pope Pius XI shows the high esteem the Church teaches husbands to have for their wives. Quote, "In view of her most noble office as wife and mother and companion," says the Pope, "the woman's subjection to her husband is not as a servant or as a minor, so that she keeps her liberty and her dignity as a human person. She does not need to obey her husband's every request if not in harmony with right reason or with the dignity due to the wife. He continues, in fact, if the husband neglect his duty, it falls to the wife to take his place in directing the family. But the structure of the family established by God must always be maintained intact. Pope Pius calls the emancipation of woman from her duties as companion and mother a crime, because he calls it an exaggerated liberty which cares not for the good of the family. That is the important point, the good of the family. The heart, he said, is only separated from the head to the great detriment of the whole body and the proximate danger of ruin. Pius XII also described the vital importance of the stay-at-home mother for the salvation of her children's souls and the good of the church and society. He said, if St. Gregory the Great could speak of the government of souls as the art of arts, surely no art is more difficult and strenuous than that of fashioning the souls of children. Fortunate the child whose mother stands by its cradle like a guardian angel to inspire and lead it in the path of goodness. The Pope explained how mothers should educate and train the child right through adolescence, illustrating their exalted status in the family and in the church's evangelizing mission. So this is precisely what the Masons and communists have worked to destroy. And, sad to say, the guardian angels have deserted their post, neglecting the duties of their state in life. Now, as a married woman is the heart of her family, so consecrated religious have always been esteemed as a principal part of the heart of the church. Until the 1960s, they had great influence in drawing souls to God and spreading his kingdom on earth through their many apostolates. Corrupting these women in the heart of the church, especially those involved in education and improving the conditions of the family, would be a major strike against Catholicism. Unfortunately, the religious orders were no match for consciousness raising and other psychological tricks. Angry at being pushed around by the patriarchal structure, nuns became a major attacking force, so much so that feminists consider them trend setters for the modern women's liberation movement. Feminism has infiltrated church bureaucracy, teaching, and liturgy. By attending or teaching in seminaries and schools of theology, feminists have been converting priests and bishops. Their ideology is now mainstream. In order to proselytize the grassroots, they've taken every opportunity for consciousness raising about women's oppression and for spreading occultism through their pseudo-Christian liturgies. No group is free from their agenda. But although they've gained vast territory, feminists are not satisfied because their only measure of equality is ordination. Now, Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical on communism, told us that communism is opposed to reason and divine revelation. As we've seen, by repudiating revelation, Christian feminism has played a great part in today's crisis of faith. Now let's look at its contribution to the crisis of morals, which stems from its opposition to reason and the natural law. And for this, let's return for a bit to the secular feminist branch, which after several decades of quiet was given new impetus by secular humanist Betty Friedan's consciousness-raising 1963 book, The Feminist Mystique. Clearly Marxist, this book claimed that women had been brainwashed into seeing the sexual roles of wife and mother as the only desirable goals for them. Friedan made housewife a derogatory term. She was influenced by Abraham Maslow, who is the leader of the human potentiality movement, which sees individuals evolving into gods independent of the authority of governments or religion. Friedan wanted a drastic reshaping of the cultural image of femininity because the existing culture, she said, did not permit women to gratify their basic need to grow and fulfill their potentialities as human beings, a need which is not solely defined by their sexual role. Friedan was a signer of the Second Humanist Manifesto. Now, secular humanism is just communism made palatable for the West. It's a manifesto which calls for a new world order states that our ultimate goal should be the fulfillment of the potential for growth in each human personality, free of traditional moral codes and an outmoded faith in a prayer-hearing God. It pours scorn on the Ten Commandments. It demands freedom of choice and the right to birth control, abortion, divorce, and all types of sexual exploration. Feminism replaced the Christian concept of womanhood and motherhood with the communist model promoted by Friedan and others. Friedan was very disturbed by early marriages and the larger families being raised by housewives. So she founded the National Organization for Women in the States to lead the humanist fight for freedom of choice in morality and for getting married women out of the home and into the workforce in order to reduce the birth rate. She was following Engels, who, as I mentioned earlier, promoted work outside the home as the key feature of women's liberation. Then childcare expert Dr. Benjamin Spock, another secular humanist, chimed in with his propaganda that Russian children whose working mothers had other serious purposes in their lives besides motherhood were emotionally more stable and adjusted than American children whose full-time mothers do nothing but worry about them. Well, the women took the bait, got other purposes into their lives, and the overthrow of civilization has proceeded at supersonic speed, just like Pope Benedict XV had predicted it would. Attacking the religious underpinnings of the traditional family, Friedan accused priests, rabbis, and ministers of prejudice because the housewife image is enshrined in the canons of their religion and in their church's dogmatic definitions of marriage and motherhood. The Catholic Church, of course, was the chief target of feminism. Secular feminists were, of course, unable to make inroads into the church until the post-conciliar renewal brought socialistic religious feminism to life. Then the feminists within the church aligned themselves with their secular sisters who had espoused the Marxist view of womanhood that fueled the secular liberation movement. And sharing their humanist goals, spiritual feminists started demanding equality of opportunity in the church and autonomy in morality. The Catholic Church's uncompromising stand on sexual morality only intensified their charges of oppression. And these charges of oppression received their intellectual fuel from anthropological theories adopted by Marx and Engels, as well as from mythology. Merlin Stone's 1978 book, When God Was a Woman, asserted that Christianity is part of an ancient conspiracy to use religion to justify male supremacy. Her theories justify the feminist rejection of Christianity and its moral code. Ruther and Stone promulgated the idea that the universe was created by the goddess Isis, who has various other names such as Gaia, Mother Earth, and so forth. The original religion, they said, was set up to worship the goddess, and male deities were usually just her consorts. For feminists, goddess-worshipping societies provide an important model in which women owned business and property, and they subscribe to the Marxist depiction of egalitarian matriarchal society as primitive communism. Further, that society was matrilineal, with children named after their mothers and inheritance through the female line because the biological father was unknown due to sexually autonomous women and group marriage, which is any number of partners. All children were legitimate and regarded as everyone's children and brought up by the collectivity. Aren't we getting back to matriarchal society today, with unmarried mothers having children by different men, and with the community, that is the state, looking after these children? In her book, Stone writes that the goddess was the patroness of sexual pleasure, temples were houses for the sacred sexual customs of the female religion, and the unmarried mother was worshipped. Adultery, she says, was glorified, and divorce and abortion easily obtained. Somewhere along the line, according to Stone and Marxist theory, this matriarchal paradise was invaded by races who worshipped male deities which they presented as superior to the goddesses of the conquered lands. And their patriarchal religion family system and form of government gradually wiped out matriarchy. The Hebrews and then the Christians completed the subjugation of women as a class system ruled by men developed in religious and secular life. So feminists reject the Bible and Christianity as devised by men to maintain a male-dominated society. Now, St. Paul outlined in Romans chapter 1, rejecting revelation and the natural law produces spiritual blindness and the loss of morals. So feminists, in their blindness, rationalize immorality as follows. If Christianity is a religion devised by scheming men, then the Decalogue can and should be rejected. Christian sexual ethics are only tools for men to control women's bodies. Indeed, Luther defines patriarchy, quote, as the subordination of women's bodies, sexuality, and reproduction to male ownership and control. The suppression of women's paganism is equated with the suppression of women's rights to reproductive self-determination and sexual autonomy, which had supposedly helped women to be independent. But the rejection of Christian morality by a small minority of women could not change the social order. So it was only after feminism aligned itself with the Marxist revolution that it could change laws hindering sexual autonomy and its economic benefits. The Masonic communist tenet of absolute equality provided the theoretical foundation for the feminist destruction of morality. This false presumption of absolute equality ignores, quote, the distinctive qualities which nature has bestowed on each sex and the necessary hierarchy in the society of the family, which only willful blindness or a disastrous and utopian attitude can ignore, said Pius XII. In the Ratzinger report, Cardinal Ratzinger said this presumption, absolute equality, entailed the rejection of the God-given roles for men and women inscribed in the laws of nature and the rupture of the indissoluble bond between sexuality and motherhood. But since the language of nature is also the language of morality, women's rejection of the natural law for atheistic pagan ideals of womanhood has produced a worldwide crisis of morality. Interestingly, religious feminists also found a precedent for ignoring gender differences in Gnosticism. The Gnostics adopted the pagan belief in an androgynous male-female God and androgynous human beings. And the difference between the sexes was considered a limitation to be overcome. Apocryphal Gnostic Gospels actually claimed that Christ said to get rid of sexual differences in order to enter heaven. Well, as Cardinal Ratzinger observed, today there's surgery to liberate those who, wanting to escape from the slavery of nature, demand the right to be male or female at one's will. And for feminists who consider it unjust that only women give birth, he remarked that science now enables the fatal rupture between sexuality and procreation, giving us procreation without sexuality. Think in vitro fertilization and surrogate motherhood. This produces the idea that every form of sexuality is equivalent. And as the Cardinal pointed out, pleasure becomes the only point of sexuality and thus a right. As we know, what St. Paul calls a chastisement of God in Romans chapter 1 is now inscribed as a right in laws that sanction homosexuality. So-called homosexual marriages are given the same social benefits as the traditional family. Perversity, including transgenderism, to coin a word, is even now, as I speak, being added to sex education. Cardinal Ratzinger also observed, quote, fecundity separated from marriage turns from being a blessing to a threat to the individual's right to happiness. So institutionalized abortion becomes another right. Clearly, communism has succeeded in overthrowing the Christian social order through feminism. In 1876, Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore put the crusade for women's rights, so-called, in the same category as moral shams, pious frauds, and socialistic schemes which are so often undertaken ostensibly in the name of religion and morality, but which are subversive of morality and order, which are the offsprings of fanaticism and serve as a mask to hide the most debasing passions." End of quote. Now, feminism has attacked not only the religious and moral foundations of the family, the basic unit of society, but also the dignity and nature of woman herself. And Pius XI warned, "If the woman descends from her truly regal throne to which she has been raised within the home by means of the gospel, she will soon be reduced to the old state of slavery, if not in appearance, certainly in reality, and become, as among the pagans, the mere instrument of man." Well, this has happened. It has always been the teaching of the Church, as expressed by Popes Leo XIII and Pius XII, that men and women are images of God and therefore of equal dignity, possessing the same rights for reciprocal affection and the interchange of duties, and what is unlawful for women is unlawful for men also. And, says Pius XII, it is impossible to uphold that the woman is in any way inferior. She is called to collaborate with the man in the propagation and development of the human race, and God has granted her gifts of inestimable value to carry out her immense responsibilities in transmitting the most intimate dispositions of soul and qualities of the spiritual and moral orders which determine character. These qualities, he says, are also an indispensable contribution to social and cultural life, and any civilization that has denigrated women by misunderstanding or excluding these qualities has been condemned to sterility and decline. Today, we're in the midst, not of the decline, but of the fall of Western civilization. Now, the trouble with feminists is that along with their faith, they also lost their devotion to Mary. Rosemary Ruther has stated that her devotion to Mary was somewhat less than her devotion to some far more powerful females that she knew, the goddesses. This proud, blasphemous attitude has been the downfall of women. History shows that chivalry and respect for women flourished when men had a tender and filial devotion to Our Lady. As the English scholar Jack Scarisbrick notes, prior to the Protestant revolt in England, Mary had a prominent place in English religious life, and he said this tempered male authority and asserted the dignity of womanhood. And as Catholic history notes, because of the great devotion to Our Lady during feudal times and the Middle Ages, women of those days were held in greater esteem than in pagan Greece and Rome. What do we have today? As women's power increases, so do disrespect for them and assaults on women and children. In 1941, Pius XII noted that in Roman times, women fled disdainfully from the duties of motherhood to give themselves rather to occupations and to play a part till then reserved to men alone. Divorces multiplied, the family began to disintegrate, and womanly affections and behavior deviated from the straight path of virtue. Christ, he said, came to restore what paganism had overthrown, and to give us the Christian concept of matrimony which St. Paul taught to his disciples. And the Pope lamented, "In our age, there is blowing the ill wind of a rebirth of paganism." Pope Pius said only God can solve the problems related to the role of woman, but he manifests himself only to the humble and obedient. It is Mary, a supreme model in humility and obedience, who can direct the efforts to restore true values. Pope Pius XII exclaimed, quote, "If life reveals to what depths of vice and degradation woman can at times descend, Mary shows to what heights she can climb, in and through Christ, even to ascending above all other creatures. What civilization, what religion has ever raised to such heights the ideal of womanhood or exalted it to such perfection? Modern humanism, laicism, Marxist propaganda, non-Christian cults have nothing to offer which can even be compared with this vision, so glorious and so humble, transcendent and yet so easily accessible. God has twice confirmed publicly Pope Pius's teaching that Mary is meant to lead the fight against the revolution. The Mother of God appeared to the humble, uneducated Bernadette of Lourdes, whose family was pious but very poor, exactly 10 years to the month after the publication of the Communist Manifesto and a series of communist uprisings across Europe. As our model and commander-in-chief, she titled herself the Immaculate Conception, indicating our weapons, purity and obedience. St. Maximilian Kolbe said the title Immaculate refers not only to Mary's absolute purity, but also to her perfect obedience. And he founded the Militia Immaculatae to fight the Masons and other enemies of the Church by fostering in minds and hearts a sharing in her perfect obedience. The second time God sent Our Lady was at Fatima, just months before Russia became the launching pad for communist destruction of Christian civilization. Lenin, the founder of the Bolsheviks who took over Russia, said, "I don't care what becomes of Russia. To hell with it. All this is only the road to a world revolution." Well, our commander-in-chief, who titled herself the Lady of the Rosary, greatly cares for Russia. She promised to save that poor nation through its collegial consecration to her Immaculate Heart. Now, consecration to Our Lady makes one her property, and she does not let the devil drag her property to hell. So the conversion of Russia will destroy the Masonic communist world order and will be the greatest public triumph of Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. Our Lady has been disobeyed for over 80 years, and the triumph of Russia is evident all around us. Our Lady of Fatima promised the world would have peace with the conversion of Russia, and the conversion will destroy all the satanic forces associated with communism. A major sign that communism is dead will be the collapse of feminism and the flowering of true Catholic womanhood working for the restoration and spread of the Christian order. In 1919, Pope Benedict XV spoke of the pressing need for the apostolate of the woman in education and the betterment of the family for the good of society. He exclaimed, "It was said that the faithfulness of a woman brought back to the path of justice the husband who had gone astray." And he quoted from 1 Corinthians, "The unbelieving husband is sanctified by the believing wife." May it soon be possible, he said, to repeat of the whole of society that it returned to the path of salvation through the example, the teaching, through the mission of the Catholic woman. Pius XII called on Catholic women and girls to clean and heal the great wound in human society caused by communism and materialism, and under God's guidance to restore the unity of order in which every element of society is given its rightful place, with God occupying the very first place. In this stability of order, he said, the world will discover the peace it ardently desires. Now recall that in 1917, Pope Benedict XV blamed women's abandonment of their family duties for upsetting the civil and domestic orders. Addressing his concern, Our Lady of Fatima's plan for peace called for fidelity to the duties of one's state in life. And she also stressed the daily rosary. Seeking peace during World War I, Pope Benedict XV inserted the invocation, "Queen of Peace, pray for us," in the Litany of Loreto. Significantly, in this time of diabolical attack on the family, Pope John Paul II inserted the title, "Queen of the Family," between Queen of the Most Holy Rosary and Queen of Peace. And on his recent visit to Malta, Pope Benedict XVI mentioned this act of his predecessor and asked us to pray to Mary under the title Queen of the Family when seeking heavenly help for our loved ones. We have Our Lady's promise that peace and order will be restored when the Immaculate Heart of Mary the conqueror of all heresies, reigns triumphant over a world restored to purity and obedience to the will of its creator. But she made clear this would only happen after we all do our part. Let us not look upon it as a chore, but as an inestimable privilege, a sweet invitation to help destroy the forces of Satan, save millions of souls, and bring about the triumph of our Blessed Mother as Queen of Heaven and Earth. Thank you.